Bonjour à tous et bienvenue aux séries de conférences de la CMTS. I'm Suzanne McGurn, President and CEO of CADTH. Je suis Suzanne McGurn, le PDG de la CMTS. I'll be moderating today's lecture. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from Ottawa, Canada, located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people and Algonquin people. Thank you to the Algonquin peoples who have been keepers and stewards of the land that I'm standing on for thousands of years over many generations. I feel very fortunate to call the Ottawa area home, but I've also traveled across this country and experienced its remarkable beauty from coast to coast. People are joining us today from various locations across this country and around the world. And I would like to encourage all of you to think about where you live, work, and play. I would also like to draw attention to the fact that September 30th, this weekend, is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation here in Canada. It is an opportunity to honor the healing journey of the residents of residential school survivors. And it's also the 10th anniversary of Orange Shirt Day. If you're not familiar with the Orange Shirt Day, I encourage you to read the very short book called The Orange Shirt by Phyllis Webstad. It's a great introduction to learning what it was like to be a child, a firsthand story and going into residential schools. I encourage everyone to take a moment to acknowledge the people who have lived before you and who have cared for and sustained the land you call home. So the series, we launched this series back in 2014 so that people from across Canada and around the world could hear directly from scholars and opinion leaders about issues in health technology assessment and healthcare. Today's talk is focused on health technology assessment, its evolution, as well as its future direction. Health technology assessments the term was coined back in the early to mid 1970s, and it has evolved since then through methodological improvements and incorporating new perspectives, particularly those of patients, and increased its transparency. However, the definition of HTA was slower to evolve. But 4 years ago, an international task group co-led by the International Network of Agencies for HTA, INAHTA, and the Health Technology Assessment International, HTAi, published a new definition for HTA. Their definition has quickly been adopted as the new standard definition internationally and has served as a cornerstone reference for today and into the future. And in fact, the very first event that I attended in my new job was a talk on this very definition. Today, we are very privileged to have one of the authors of that new definition with us, Dr. Brian O'Rourke. Brian is a familiar face to many of you as he served as CADTH's President and CEO for more than a decade, following a distinguished career as a pharmacist and a healthcare executive with the Canadian military. Although he says he's officially retired, he continues to play an active role in the global HTA community, serving as chair of the HTA Steering Committee at the Center for Innovation and Regulatory Science, and he has just recently been elected as the president of ISPOR. Brian received the 2023 Dr. Jill M. Saunders Award of Excellence in Health Technology Assessment at CADTH Symposium in May of this year. CADTH presents this award to individuals who have made significant and lasting contributions to HTA, evidence-based drug reviews, or optimal technology management in Canada. Today, I'm excited to hear Brian talk to you about the drivers behind the new HTA definition, his reflections on how we can reimagine HTA in the years to come. As he does that, I know he will generate lots of comments and questions. Please feel free to use the Q&A tab to jot questions off to Brian during the session. I will be collating them and trying to get through as many of them as possible after Brian finishes his remarks. So over to you, Brian. I'm looking forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for that very kind introduction. I'm not sure if I fit either the scholar or the opinion leader. You might need a third category of old retired HTA practitioners. So I probably fit that one better. I'm very proud to have received the Jill Sanders Award this year. Jill was an amazing individual And when she passed away in 2010, we decided that it would be appropriate to launch this award in her name, reflecting the impact that she had on HTA globally. So what I decided to talk about today in my lecture is something that I've been thinking about for a number of years, and that is it time to reimagine this science of health technology assessment? So I'm going to speak to some of the key challenges that are out there and some of the rationale for why I think the time is right to look at perhaps new ways, new practices in the field of HTA. I'm going to focus my comments mostly from a global perspective, not simply a Canadian perspective. I no longer represent the expertise in Canada. That's for people like Suzanne and Doug Clark, who was recently named as CEO of the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. So I will speak to it from globally. Next slide, please. This is my disclosure slide because it actually does represent a very accurate reflection about my activities since I retired from CADTH in 2020. I golf probably 4 to 5 times per week, and it's a year-round event for me now. We have a place in Florida that we spend our winters, and it's right on a golf course. In fact, today, normally at this time, I would be out on the golf course enjoying some company with friends and beating a little white ball around a field. But since I left CADTH, I have stayed connected with colleagues and friends in healthcare and in health technology assessment. And again, here, a lot of it from a global perspective. So my disclosures do include a number of volunteer activities. These are all unpaid activities. I was appointed in November 2020 as the Colonel Commandant of the Royal Canadian Medical Service. This is an honorary appointment. I serve as an honorary colonel for a wonderful group of healthcare providers that wear uniform in Canada. And to any military members, past or present, who are on this presentation, I would like to thank you for your service to Canada. I do some mentoring, and I know some of the people that I mentor are on this lecture. Last year, I was appointed an emeritus member of the Canadian Health Leadership Network. I do chair the HTA Steering Committee at the Center for Innovation and Regulatory Sciences, and we'll be having our steering committee and a workshop next week, actually, in London. And as Suzanne mentioned, I'm the president of ISPOR. The president of ISPOR serves as the chair of the board of directors, and my term is from July of 2023 to June of 2024. But I've also been very active with ISPOR. I served as the chair of their HTA Council, participated in their various roundtables that happen around the world, and I've served on a number of other councils and committees at ISPOR. I have done some paid consulting and continue to do some paid consulting as an advisor, mostly HTA and payer advisor. Two that I'm involved with at the moment. One is a venture capital company called Gilda Healthcare, based in the Netherlands. And it's been fascinating to engage with some that are investors or venture capitalists. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as I get into my presentation. Another company that I advise as a payer advisor with several others is a company called CCX. This is a group of IT and Wall Street type professionals who've developed a price negotiation platform, which also does contract management, deal cataloging, and they've developed a number of simulation tools to facilitate price negotiation, getting to deals efficiently. I've been involved with several projects, some with the Office of Health Economics in the UK, with a group of physicians from the MD Anderson Cancer Center in the United States, where they were doing a report on the Inflation Reduction Act and asked for my thoughts. I've done some work with a consulting company called the Boston Consulting Group, mainly their team in France, and several other advisory boards on individual products with companies and some consulting companies as well. The next slide, please. So the premise for this lecture today is to think about whether we actually need to reimagine HTA and to reimagine reimbursement, that payer aspect. So is HTA already fit for purpose? Do we even really need to change HTA? Do we need to continually evolve a more traditional approach to HTA to help us assess some of these emerging technologies? Or is it time for this revolution? Do we truly need to reimagine how we do HTA? Now, some of you might be sitting there saying, you know what, we need a fourth option here, an option that maybe HTA has run its course. Let's just get rid of HTA. So whether you're sitting there as a patient, as a clinician, as an innovator, a consultant, a regulator, academic, payer, or HTA practitioner, you likely have your own thoughts on which of these options we should pursue. My contention is that we need a bit of number one and number two, and a lot of number three. Next slide, please. So one of the areas that I've been much more focused on since leaving CADTH is investment in healthcare and health technologies and pharmaceuticals. It has been fascinating to see and hear what investors and venture capitalists are thinking about. What types of ventures are they willing to invest their money in, and why have they chosen those companies and those technologies? But I've also seen that on occasion, some of their thinking is flawed. And I say it's flawed because they focus solely on the regulatory aspect of that new technology. They haven't spent enough time listening to patients, listening to clinicians, and particularly they haven't focused enough on the pricing and reimbursement component of that particular technology. And especially as we look at the regional differences in how we do HTA or value assessment, price negotiation, and product listing in areas around the world. Having said all that, I think there is a tremendous opportunity for the global HTA and payer communities to exert greater influence on investment in health technology. Next slide, please. I've also seen how entrepreneurs and investors think, and they think very differently from those of us that have been involved in the public sector or the not-for-profit sector as a payer or as a consumer. I've been both intrigued and amazed, and sometimes I'd say disappointed in their thinking. They have such great risk tolerance. They have great confidence in their ability to find that next blockbuster product or company. And we have a very active venture capital community in Canada, and much of it is coordinated and promoted by Kim Furlong, the Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Venture Capital and Private Equity Association. Kim is, of course, well known to many of us when she was with Amgen Canada, and we're very proud to see her continued success. So what are investors looking at these days? Who is out there thinking like Henry Ford or Arlene Dickinson or Michelle Romanow? Next slide, please. This is a top 10 list of some big trends, and it was put together by a company called Simply Wall Street. They're an online company that provides long-term investing advice. It has its origins in Australia, but it's now a global entity with greater than 5 million online subscribers, me being one of them. So they've provided some market insight into these trends, focusing on what they refer to as secular trends. They've divided trends into cyclical trends, those that last between 1 and 5 years, more fads than trends, and these secular trends that run the course over several decades. And their contention is that policymakers have some control over the cyclical trends, but very little control over these secular trends. So we need to be looking at what are these trends and what is the impact that they will have on our healthcare systems and on health technology assessment from a privacy perspective, a security perspective, ethics, equity, value, and that impact that we mentioned. So how do we as consumers or innovators or clinicians or policymakers stay in touch with these big trends and which ones will have the most influence on health and health technology? They did give a few examples under the health technology trend, where they mentioned things like minimally invasive surgery, robotic surgery, nanobots and smart sensors, smart pills, artificial intelligence, guided diagnostics and treatment, augmented reality, virtual reality, remote monitoring, and so forth. Next slide, please. And of course, you can't do a presentation these days without getting some advice from a chatbot. So I asked ChatGPT to provide me with their analysis of the top 10 trends in HTA. And there's no major surprises in this list. Many of you are probably involved or aware of many of these. So I actually found ChatGPT's list a bit disappointing because I was expecting something truly revolutionary to come from our chatbot. Next slide. So I wanted to bring those global trends and the ChatGPT trends back to what I believe are some of these mega trends that are going to impact the way forward for health technologies and health technology assessment. Emerging blockbusters, we're always looking for what is that next big blockbuster therapy or device or diagnostic. When we think of some of what we've seen through the years, going from the small molecules into biologics and into gene and cell therapies, and we're seeing more and more blockbusters in oncology and rare diseases. Think of the anti-obesity drugs, which is predicted to be a $100 billion market by 2030. Alzheimer's disease, if we can ever come up with a drug or a treatment that can prevent or slow or cure Alzheimer's, just imagine, that's the golden goose. We think of artificial intelligence guided development as a more efficient approach to finding molecules or technologies for diagnosis and treatment, and how regulators are accelerating the approval of these types of technologies, but in many cases with very limited evidence for us to do a proper assessment from an HTA or a payer perspective. During the pandemic, many of the payers globally were very impressed and relied very heavily on the HTA agencies in their particular countries. And they still want more of these reviews, and they want them faster. They loved how it worked during the pandemic. How do we evaluate and, most importantly, reimburse some of these emerging non-traditional technologies? I speak mostly here of digital therapeutics and artificial intelligence and these gaming type systems with augmented and virtual reality. There have been several instances of companies that have received very significant venture capital and grew immensely, only to subsequently fail because we could not find a pathway to reimburse their digital technology. And there's also a great need for health technology assessment to become more involved, that greater involvement in public health, in population health, and specifically to focus on health equity, particularly for marginalized populations, but also for the rich countries versus the low and middle income countries. And I've put one here about big money engagement in healthcare. Healthcare is a multi-trillion-dollar business globally. So naturally, these big companies like Amazon and Google and others are developing a health business, and they're interested in seeing where they can exert their influence and create a business model. We're seeing it from large charities like the Gates Foundation and Chan Zuckerberg. We're seeing pharmacy chains like Walmart and CVS and Shoppers Drug Mart here in Canada engaging in primary care and other aspects of healthcare beyond the distribution of pharmaceuticals through their pharmacy systems. So to me, the question on these mega trends in HTA is, how do we speed up the evaluation and the reimbursement of traditional and non-traditional technologies in a challenging fiscal environment, that affordability issue that you see there, while considering other aspects of value like equity and the environment? Wow, what a big question. And how do we, as HTA producers, practitioners, how do we stay relevant in the eyes of payers, patients, and innovators? Next slide, please. This is just some examples of issues and some potential solutions, or how countries around the world are dealing with these challenges. It's a very high-level list. And I won't go through each and every one of them. The two that are most crucial are those very first two, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. So let's be clear here, that price negotiation in the United States, in that largest and most influential marketplace and most profitable marketplace, is being perceived as a major threat to innovation and to the pharmaceutical industry. And it's going to have a huge impact on the global marketplace. And the European Union, their HTA regulation being implemented as we speak, is, in my opinion, the most important development for the continued relevance of the HTA community, with the collaboration, the efficiencies, the harmonization, the governance, the leadership that they're producing, I think will go a long way to helping us reimagine HTA. But we're also seeing significant cost containment measures in Germany, new methods for regulating and funding health products in France, restructuring and new approaches in Italy, in the United Kingdom, in Japan, a court judgment that overturned the legality of the new HTA system that was announced in Spain, continued judicialization of healthcare and health technology assessment in Latin America. And China, they continue to pursue their fundamental access policy of offering enormous volumes at very low prices. So next slide. So here it is. To me, the growing challenge for HTA, is it about access? Is it about value to patients and taxpayers? Is it about cost control? Or is it about innovation? So let's explore a little bit of that. Next slide, please. So here again, I'm talking about the reimagining component of those three options that I listed in my opening slide. So any reimagining, again, in my perspective, needs to build upon some of those fundamental principles and practices that have been put in place over the past 30 to 40 years. Things like clinical effectiveness, cost effectiveness, budget impact, patient, clinician, and industry engagement, scientific advice, real-world evidence, ethics, committee deliberation, and so forth. These are all items that we need to build upon as we look to reimagine HTA. Next slide, please. So this is the new definition that Suzanne referred to, and I was very pleased to be one of the co-chairs with Via Ortwijn from the Netherlands and Tara Schuler from Edmonton, who is representing INAHTA, in leading this global committee or task force on this new definition. We had representation from INAHTA, from HTAi, from ISPOR, from the regional HTA organizations in Europe, in Asia Pacific, in Latin America, and we had the World Health Organization involved to represent some of the lower and middle income countries. And we had some key thoughts that each of these organizations felt were important to include in the new definition. Things like the multidisciplinary component, that we have explicit methods, that we need to talk about value and the life cycle. But most importantly, we considered that this was a milestone in international collaboration. It was the first time that we were able to really get all of the key players in the agencies together to come up with this new definition. Next slide, please. I also think it's really important as we think about reimagining HTA that we gather learnings from other communities, the investment community that I mentioned earlier, and the regulatory community. They've done a fantastic job in advancing both their governance, their standardization, their regional collaborations, their benchmarking, their ability to share capacity through these facilitated regulatory pathways referred to as both recognition and reliance, where countries with immature regulatory agencies are able to recognize a decision from another jurisdiction or rely very heavily on the work that was done in that other agency. So many of those items I think we should be looking at within the HTA community. Next slide, please. So here we go. These are some of the ideas that I have been thinking about for a number of years that I think can help us advance health technology assessment. Next slide, please. And I've grouped them under these 4 themes. And some of the ideas that I'm going to talk about reflect both that evolutionary component of existing aspects of our HTA systems, and some of them are truly new ideas that I think should be considered as we look to reimagine the future of HTA. So next slide, please. I'm going to go through most of these fairly quickly. So there will be time, hopefully, to explore any or all of them in more depth when we enter into the question and answer period. So the first idea is on harmonization, and it also includes collaboration. I do believe that there is an opportunity and a need to create some form of a leadership council for HTA, just like the regulators have done with the heads of their regulatory agencies getting together regularly. Now, to do this, we need some financing. We need probably to develop a secretariat. We need participation from the heads or the decision makers of these agencies or groups involved, but I think it's possible. We have some of the components there. We could use some of the existing bodies that we have with HTAi, with INAHTA, with ISPOR, some of the regional networks, but could we drive that to a more global HTA leadership council? I think there's also an opportunity to create this International Council on Harmonization-like model that the regulators have done to help to develop standards and harmonize processes, and then to build upon that with some sort of an accreditation process that individual agencies can use to allow them to develop their credibility within their own jurisdiction. And I think there is a large opportunity for that capacity sharing to develop methods where reviews that are done by a larger agency can be either recognized or relied upon in countries that just either don't have an HTA system or have very small or immature HTA systems. Next slide, please. So idea 2 on life cycle management. Most of this is more of an evolutionary network. We've been doing horizon scanning for many years, but it does need to be centralized, a global horizon scanning. And I think if we engage with the investor community, we can really understand what are those trends or technologies that they're very interested in so that we can better prepare the payer community for some of the technologies that are going to come our way in 5 years or 10 years. I think we need, from a capacity building perspective, and probably from a consistency perspective in the advice we provide to pharmaceutical and medical device companies, a way to better coordinate all of the scientific advice programs globally. I think it's a no-brainer that regulatory and HTA reviews need to be conducted in parallel so that the regulators and the HTA bodies can learn together as they do their reviews, whether it's a benefit risk from the regulator or a cost effectiveness or clinical effectiveness review by the HTA body. RWE, lots of work happening there. I think it really needs to be better coordinated and collected, and that we need a harmonized approach for reassessment once we have collected and analyzed that real world evidence. And it's time, it's really time to get serious about disinvestment. We've talked about it for years. It's hard, I recognize that fact, but we need to create space in our budgets to allow for some of the new technologies. Next slide, please. On the process innovation, this is where we do need to get more efficient, faster, and more harmonized in how we conduct HTA, our methods and our processes. I think we do need to look at artificial intelligence tools to have AI-supported health technology assessment. I think we need new methods and validated methods to conduct these rapid and ultra rapid reviews to deal with that payer challenge of they want more and they want faster HTA. I think we need to think of ways to better incorporate patient-generated evidence through remote monitoring systems into our HTA evidence package and how we make decisions. I think it's time for us to revisit the quality adjusted life year and all of our health economics models that are out there. We have two major ways of looking at that health economics decision-making, the cost effectiveness approach or the added clinical value approach that Germany and France and others rely upon. So is it time for the next generation of the QALY to allow a more standardized approach to that value assessment? And because we are faced with limited clinical or quantitative evidence at product launch, we also need an increased focus on qualitative evidence and these other modifiers of value. And next slide, please. And of course, if we are to allow earlier and more equitable access of technologies, if we are seen to help promote a healthy life sciences industry, we need some form of risk mitigation, both to patients as well as to payers and taxpayers. Payers being public payers, private payers, statutory insurance companies, whatever it happens to be. We do need, I believe, to get more engaged in these outcomes-based or performance-based contracts. We need to be paying for things that work, that have delivered good outcomes for patients. I think we also need to get more creative with our reimbursement models, whether it's subscriptions or accrual methods, whatever it happens to be. Let's look at other industries and what they're using and go beyond simple discounts and rebates, which in many cases don't mitigate the risks to all of the players. And I think if we are to introduce these successfully, there is an opportunity to investigate the use of these third-party platforms, the one that I mentioned, this company like CCX, for both making our price negotiation more efficient, ways to help utilize these companies to independently manage the contracts, to help adjudicate any performance-based contracts, and to create a way that we can catalog all of the deals and learn from those deals through some benchmarking. And next slide, please. So if we are to promote access and value while supporting the life sciences industry, it is going to take capacity sharing through more collaboration and harmonization. And some of the collaboration that Suzanne and her colleagues in some of the Commonwealth countries have started is amazing. And I think that's what we need more of. We need to get efficient, much smarter and much faster with our HTA, building upon some of those AI tools that I mentioned. We need to learn from other sectors, the investment community, price negotiations, regulatory community. We need to start buying outcomes, not things, not technologies. We do need to get serious with disinvestment, and we need to engage more and engage often. And of course, if that fails, then let's go back to the chat box and chat GPT and see if they can come up with better ways of doing what we do. And next slide, please. So I've thrown a lot of ideas out there. I've identified some of the trends, some of the challenges, and I will state that particularly since I've retired and I have lots of time to think on the golf courses, idea generation is easy. It's the simple part. Implementation is the hard part. It's the tough part. So I'm going to start throwing that baton to many of you in the audience to help advance and reimagine that future of HTA. That concludes my presentation, and I'll turn it back to Suzanne.
Thank you very much, Brian. I am very envious of your golf slide, and perhaps someday I'll be able to join you. Lots of really interesting questions, so I'm going to just kick off with some of the questions. Some of them are specific, and I think some of them are, how good is your crystal ball? So first one, sort of building on where you were ending about pricing. And one of the questions that has arisen is there an opportunity, or have you seen elsewhere to actually get to transparent pricing? Can we still have value-based work, but with greater transparency?
Yeah, transparency is tough. We're not going to get over the hurdle of transparency until we better deal with the aspects of low and middle income countries that just can't afford many of the new technologies. It's an affordability issue. So unless the high income countries are willing to allow pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies to provide those products to the low and middle income countries at lower prices, then we're probably never going to get there because of reference pricing. So that's a tough challenge. I really don't think at this point in time we are ready to deal with totally transparent pricing, but I do think there are opportunities to improve how we do pricing and negotiation of prices.
Thanks for that one, Brian. Another really interesting question. A few people have picked up on your comments about health economics, and the question is, your comment on reevaluating health economics is very timely. I've long believed that current models underestimate the ultimate lifelong value of some of the more expensive therapies, or any therapies. And I'm thinking of elements such as gene therapy, biomarker-driven personalized care, etc. There is a need to be able to balance the immediate and in all cases, therapy to the health system, and to capture the lifelong costs and benefits related to productivity, quality of life. So any thoughts, or have you seen any models emerging that are of particular interest that people might want to be paying attention to? And I know this topic is near and dear to many of your ISPOR members.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'll preface my comments by saying I'm not a health economist. I've had some training in cost effectiveness analysis. I can read a report, but a lot of the algebra that goes along with it and the components that our brilliant health economists globally are the practitioners. They're the ones that will lead us into the future. What I have seen are increasing examples of our current methods of health economics not working because of some of these emerging types of technologies, just as whoever asked that question referred to. Certainly in the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act, the legislation specifically prohibits them from utilizing cost effectiveness analysis. So some of our leaders in academia and industry and at ICER in the US have started to think about models, health economic models, that might build on some of the concepts of a quality adjusted life year or a clinical added value model out of Germany or France. So yeah, I do think there is a great opportunity here or some sort of a summit or a task force or multiple task forces on how do we advance the health economics to deal with some of these emerging challenges and emerging technologies.
Thanks, Brian. I have to admit, there's so many questions. I have to scan them to get them in order here. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what strategies could be used towards disinvestment, and based on your experience, which does span many years and in various roles, what are the kinds of things that you're imagining people need to spend more time on?
So yeah, so here again, I think we've been sniffing around disinvestment for many years, and the answer that I've heard mostly, and from myself when I was a payer as well, was that it's so hard to take something away from somebody when they already have it. Well, I'm not proposing that we actually take something away if it is providing some element of value to that particular patient. But we need to stop giving out any more of that to new patients. So there, to me, some form of a grandmothering model would help, I think, get over some of that barrier of taking things away. And I think we also need to be very upfront with the clinicians and the patients that they have a voice in some of that decision making, and that if it's not working, we need to have policies in place to stop it. So stop orders of some sort. But to me, grandfathering would be a wonderful first step.
Brian, you touched on patients a couple of times in your presentation, and do you have any comments about the role of the patient community in HTA decision-making with HTA 2.0, and maybe particularly any reflections on marginalized populations or those voices that haven't been heard?
Yeah, boy, that's a really deep and important question. I have a ton of thoughts on this. Certainly when we first introduced patient engagement at CADTH in 2010, we looked around the world looking for best practices, best models, and we really couldn't find much out there. We talked to the folks in Scotland who had tried to do it, and they said, yeah, we introduced it, but it's really not working for us. So we just launched it and we learned as we went. And I think that is the approach that we do need to take with the patient community. There's some brilliant patient representatives and organizations out there. They have some wonderful thoughts and ideas. We just need to continue to engage with that patient community. We need to allow them to advance some of the concepts, the patient-generated evidence that they're doing, to insert that into our decision-making process. So yeah, engage them in every aspect, and particularly as we look at the investment community, talk to them about marginalized patients as well, and low and middle income countries. There needs to be solutions for the entire globe, not just the people who can pay for technologies.
Thanks, Brian. You're so timely that you're going to let me do a lot of the questions, and there's a lot of great question here. This is sort of linking about what you talked about HTA generally, and one of your areas, which is about payers and payees. And the question is, based on your experience, do you actually think payers are open to new developments in HTA, especially in terms of new methodologies, use of AI, new economic models, or do you think payers really prefer the old methodologies and it's convenient and familiar to them? So any thoughts about, sort of how do we bring everyone along to this future you imagine?
I don't think I've ever met a payer, whether it's a private payer, a public payer, or a statutory insurance company in Europe, that isn't open to new thinking, new ideas. Now, it needs to be relevant to their decision-making process. We have to present it in the right way. We have to respect the fact that payers are extremely busy individuals. They have many competing priorities from the political sense, from the media sense. And we in that HTA community need to provide solutions that support their decision-making needs. So with that as the premise, I do believe that payers will be very open to some of these new concepts. Yes, there's going to be some hurdles. There's going to be some legislative issues. There's going to be some political issues to deal with. But if we don't do it, we are going to look back and say, well, we had a chance to be more relevant and we missed that opportunity?
Brian, a really good question. I know I get asked this one a lot, and I've probably been asked this in many jobs. So do you, as you do your presentation and you think about the future, and again, this isn't just from a Canadian context, but internationally, do you think that HTA can have enough value if it keeps focusing a lot in a lot of countries just on drugs, where more than 85% of healthcare expenditures are on other things? And how do you square the circle with that? And how does HTA perhaps start broadening and looking at care delivery pathways, hospital funding, impacts on global budgets? And again, I think it depends on where you sit, your familiarity with what is done in these spaces. So from your vantage point, what's that balance look like in the future?
Now, interestingly, many of the agencies that participate in INAHTA and some of these other global HTA organizations and associations and societies are focused not on drugs. They're focused on other parts of the healthcare system, medical devices, diagnostics, public health, vaccines, et cetera. So there are models out there where there are agencies that do focus on some of these technologies and new technologies. I do think it's interesting because we at ISPOR about 2 weeks ago, we kicked off strategic planning. It's time for a new ISPOR strategic plan. And our board brainstormed about some of the market trends. And we focused in on 3 major trends that are impacting the future of health economics and outcomes research. One of them was on affordability and getting serious with disinvestment, all these sorts of things. One was on these non-traditional type of technologies that are coming our way, digital health, et cetera. And one was on a more holistic approach to health economics and outcomes research, or HTA, meaning we do need to go beyond the drugs or the technologies to other aspects of healthcare, and whether we can provide some of that support in decision-making to other aspects of healthcare. And we specifically spelt holistic with a W in front of it, WHO, WHO-listic, so that we represent some of the low and middle income countries, the marginalized populations as we move this forward.
Any good conversation, talks about risk sharing. And I think the question that someone has asked, I think is really, really well worded. On the top of sort of risk sharing and risk mitigation, what are your thoughts and ideas on how risk management can be more broadly shared among not just the payer and the manufacturer, but innovators, healthcare providers, patients, evaluators, payers? How do we have a more thoughtful conversation about risks as we move forward on these new treatments?
Yeah, so I think part of it goes back to what are we looking to do? What are we trying to do? And at the end of the day, we do want to ensure that patients have early and equitable access to promising new drugs or technologies or treatments or diagnostics. And how do we ensure that there's also still value for taxpayers or for that private insurance company to move this forward while we're still promoting innovation and a healthy life sciences sector? And I think it is possible to do all of that. Where I think we might have missed it and continue to miss it is when we talk about risk, we internalize that, the risk to me and my organization, my peeps, as opposed to the global risk or the shared risk of adding these technologies. And that's with each of these different stakeholders. We need to be talking more about that shared risk. And that's why I think if we start thinking of it that we're buying outcomes and buying value, we're not buying technologies or drugs. I think that's how we'll try and get over that concept of risk management, risk sharing.
Brian, one of you've touched on it in a couple of answers, but maybe if you could just explore a little bit more as you sit in your chair as the president of ISPOR right now, and you have the opportunity to engage with high income countries, who have probably had HTA for many years, the medium and lower income countries who are increasingly embracing HTA. do we have things to learn from the middle and low income countries?
We absolutely do. And this goes back to my experience as the chair of the HTA Council at ISPOR and some of my work with CIRS as well. So the ISPOR HTA Council runs 5 global HTA roundtables, one in Asia Pacific, one in the Middle East and Africa, one in Latin America, one in Europe, and one in North America. The topics discussed are very diverse. Sometimes there's some overlap, but it really is topics that are truly relevant to that particular part of the world. When we talked with our folks through these roundtables in the Middle East and Africa, many of them being low and middle income countries, they don't have these large HTA agencies or systems in place. They were really focused on budget impact. And are there ways that we can minimize the budget impact of technologies? In the Asia Pacific, they learned from us and then bypassed us in some of things like risk sharing, performance-based contracting, real world evidence. So yeah, I think we need to continue to look at our colleagues in other parts of the world to see how things can advance in our part of the world. And as I mentioned earlier, in Europe, that is the way that we need to go from a global perspective as well.
Brian, you started this talk off talking about the investors, and I will have to say I've only ever once been in a session where the investors have been brought in so directly to the conversation. And there's a great question. I think someone's really, trying to tie those pieces together. So how can the inherent disparity in the priorities between healthcare systems and industry and innovators and investors be better aligned? Thinking about the priorities of investors and innovators being on market share, revenue, and profitability versus economic sustainability, patient access to treatments, and outcomes for payers. How do you make that work?
Wow, very simple question, he says sarcastically. Let me reflect on that by talking a little bit about the company that I and several others provide some payer and HTA advice to, this Gilda Healthcare based in the Netherlands. And they've just recently launched an 800 million euro fund where they're looking at investing in a small number of companies. So what we've focused on in giving them advice and great leadership from their companies, their motto is better health at lower cost. So they're truly looking for the winners, the winner technologies that will benefit society, benefit patients, benefit Wall Street, benefit investors, benefit innovators, the companies. So they're really good thinkers. They've focused in on what is important from a regulator's perspective. They've created a checklist. What is important from a patient perspective, a clinician's perspective, and a payer's perspective. So they have developed these checklists to better understand how the entire stakeholder community can benefit from these new and emerging technologies. And whenever they are about to think about investing in a company, in many times, now they're brilliant in understanding all the financial numbers associated with the companies, et cetera. But they do reach out to me and others to ask them about, do you see any issues with being reimbursed for this particular type of a technology, particularly in the med tech field? And that's where I think that's where the community of HTA and payers can probably better align with that investment or innovator community.
So Brian, there's a little note in my speaker things that says you can end earlier if there's no questions coming in. So I can reassure you that that is not the case. However, we are drawing to the end of our time available to chat today. And what we always do at the end of these sessions, if I moderate them correctly, is give you time just to go back. And if people can only remember one thing about today's session, or one thing you encourage people to do as they walk away from this, what's your key message that you want our audience to take away?
Since we have multifaceted stakeholders participating here and all interested in the HTA community, I think my key message is that a reimagined HTA ecosystem can promote early and equitable access. It can demonstrate value to taxpayers and other types of payers. It can introduce some form of affordability or cost control measures, and it can help promote a healthy life sciences sector.
Thanks, Brian. I would say I wholeheartedly agree with all of the things that we can do if we approach it with the right mindset. I want to take a minute to thank our audience. It's great to have an audience that is as engaged with questions as this one. And Brian, thank you so much for your talk today. It is a great honor to have you both as the former CEO, but also as our recent Jill M. Saunders Award. Thank you so much for your time. And to the audience, this session will be available, including the slides, online later this week. So hopefully for those of you who want to go back and refresh some of the great ideas that Brian put forward, you'll get a chance to do that. Thank you all, and thank you for joining us for CADTH's lecture series. Merci, miigwech.
Bye, everyone.